Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back. And if you are just tuning in with me for the very first time, it's so nice to meet you. And I'm really glad you're here with me today. I am your host, Heather Carey, nutritionist, chef, mom, and a woman who has been around the block with food. I want to open up about real food in relation to health, weight, and our bodies so you can make peace with what you eat. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I had the pleasure of talking to Dai Manuel, who is a man with a vulnerable story to share. Dai is a lifestyle mentor and executive performance coach, and he shared very openly with me about his early struggles with food and alcohol and how he overcame both through honesty, openness, and a shift in mindset that starts from the inside out. Now, if you're struggling with food or alcohol or anything else that you feel takes precedent over being present in your life, you will want to definitely take a listen to my interview with Dai. So tune in. Hey, everybody. Today I have Dai Manuel, who is a lifestyle mentor and executive performance coach, and who knows the struggle of the juggle and keeping his health and happiness a priority. He models his work based on the 5 F's: fitness, family, faith, and finances, with an overarching roof of fun, built on a rock-solid foundation of health. Dai is on a mission to inspire and positively impact 1 million role models across the globe, encouraging them to lead a functionally healthy life through education, community, and a whole lot of encouragement. As an award-winning digital thought leader and author, Dai has mastered the art of leading by example, always staying true to his values. He knows firsthand how challenging it can be to juggle life's responsibilities while prioritizing health and happiness. So welcome to the podcast, Dai. How are you today?
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. You know, it's Vancouver, Canada. It's a beautiful day today. It's brisk out, but it's going to get warmer later, and I love it. It's just
Nice.
got it for a little walk, but to get ready for this great conversation we're going to have. And I'm honored to be here with you
All
today.
right.
You know,
Great.
I really am.
Fantastic. Yeah. So a couple of weeks ago, we talked a little off air, and I know you have a personal story that's part of your overall life story, and you've had your share of personal challenges that I believe led you to where you are today, to become a coach who helps to inspire change in others and live their best lives. So why don't we just start there with your story? I mean, I know we talked about your childhood a little bit and your relationship with alcohol, and I just am suspecting that probably has influenced where you are now. So why don't we just jump in with that?
Well, thanks, Heather. You know, like many of us, and I'm sure there's a lot of people listening and watching this that will be they're going to relate, I believe, because I think we all relate to this. You know, if you sort of go by Joseph Campbell's work, and he coined the term the hero's journey, you know, this idea of all of us going through this life and struggling. And as Buddha says, you know, you don't get out of this life without some suffering. And, you know, we all have those moments, but it's what do we do in those moments, right? And more importantly, what do we do after? And I've definitely found myself in a couple situations where, you know, pardon the cliche, but that proverbial rock bottom, I felt like I was there. But more than that, I was like, hey, I wonder what's under this rock, you know, like I'm going to pick it up and crawl under it. Oh, look at that. You can go deeper. There's a sub basement, you know, like, anyways, you know, so I can appreciate when people are feeling that place of despair and like, there's nowhere else to go. And, you know, to be fair, my life up to about age 9 was very idyllic, you know, very, very Rockwell-ish, you know, like it was my brother and I with my parents. We had some pets, had a nice home. Both my parents were working professionals. My dad had a vet practice that he started, and you know, I'd go as far to give him the label he was a workaholic. I grew up watching that. That was just normal. But my mom, she loved to work. She got great fulfillment as a registered nurse, and but she always had a side hustle. always. My mom was the one that always had something going on. Whether there's a little antique store, or eventually getting into more of a B&B, to working as an interior designer. Like, I mean, it was just always something going on the side. And so I grew up with that. And so that was very normal, seeing these types of things and also picking up on that work ethic. And but at age 9, sort of that bomb was dropped on my brother and I. And I'm going to date myself right now. I'm an 80s child, right? So born in late 70s. Really, those formative years were during the 80s. This is
Yeah, me
around the
too.
mid 80s.
That's okay. You're not dating
Okay.
yourself.
Great. Well, I have to for my kids to give them context, right? Because they just
Right.
don't understand. Because this is pre-Google, right? And
Oh, yeah.
and as I tell my kids, I'm older than Google, so you guys smarten up. I know what the world's like without all this tech. And of course, they always rebut with, "Well, are you older than TVs too?" And I'm like, "Whoa, now you're watch it. Who pays for your education?" That's what I'm saying. So here at age 9, though, a bomb was dropped, and my parents told my brother and I that they were getting divorced. And separating, ultimately divorcing. And I know a lot of people are thinking, "Well, that's not a good deal." I mean, gosh, more than half the relationships in the world nowadays end in divorce. And it's like, sure. But back in the mid 80s, growing up in a small town, there was a lot of stigmatized beliefs around that, and there was only one other kid in my class that didn't have his original parents together. So right away, there's this minority group, and we don't have any outlets, anyone to speak to or talk to, and there's no resources. I don't get to go online and find communities or information to help me with this. And my parents, they were busy. They had their own stuff going on. I can relate to it now because being in my mid 40s now, that was sort of the age that they were when this all transpired as well. So it's kind of neat to see that differently now. I have a lot more respect and empathy. But I'll tell you, going through it back then, I didn't know what to do, and that emotional overwhelm. I was looking for something that I could control, and I found something. And that thing was video games, movie watching, and really eating my emotions, or I should say eating to influence my emotions. I learned very quickly that if I eat certain types of foods, and these are foods that are usually very high calorically speaking, so they have lots of calories, but very poor nutrition value, and so I'm not sitting around Heather saying, "Hey, Heather, can you pass me some more salad, please?" Like that was never said. Okay.
Yeah, you're not getting like satisfied on carrots and celery, right?
No, not at all. And so, this became my normal. And I found very quickly I could influence how I was feeling in those moments by eating certain things or doing certain things. And that was a valuable lesson as far as understanding how to escape from my life. And that continued for almost 6 years. And by the time I was age 15, I remember very distinctly the day my mom took me to the doctor's office. Dr. Quinn pulls my mom aside and is like, "Hey, Betty Ann, Dai is morbidly obese." And meanwhile, I'm sitting in the office, the door's ajar. I can hear them having this conversation, which I think was by design. And I'm already feeling pretty low. Like I've got dealing with some mental health challenges, especially social anxiety, feeling very depressed. I was lonely. I was, and based on my own choice, though, I was very introverted. I sort of escaped. And I remember we came out of that, and of course, my mom's concerned, and she's always been someone that's battled with her weight as well, so she feels somewhat responsible for my current state. And it really wasn't their fault; it was me. I was choosing to do that, and life was just really hard. It was really hard. But before I turned 16, I had this moment one day. And I know down the state side, you have ESPN, and up in Canada, we have TSN, the sports network. You're right. And I always used to love watching the highlights because, they'd have these TSN turning points, right? These moments where just everything changes. The tide changes for maybe somebody that was losing or behind a few points, and they come out ahead to win it, right? This turnaround story. And I used to love that, right? Who doesn't love those kind of stories? I mean, come on. And my TSN turning point was at 15 one day, getting out of the shower, and I didn't have a chance to do my hack. And Heather, I had this great way of, I'd stay in the shower just a couple minutes longer right before I get out, and I'd turn the water on really hot because I knew inevitably it would create so much heat in the room that the mirror would be covered in condensation by the time I got out. This way, I didn't have to look at my reflection. Like this is the extent of which I avoided to even acknowledge how I was. And I know everyone can relate to this, like when we're feeling really low, we don't want any reminders of where we're at. It's
Of
like, I already know where I am
course.
at. I don't need you telling me, right?
Hmm.
And that morning, the mirror wasn't covered in condensation. I was being rushed by my dad to get out for some commitment. I don't know what it was even today, but regardless, I got out, and in my peripheral, as I was toweling off, I just decided to turn and look at me, and it was hard. It was really hard. Like instantly, I just became very overwhelmed with emotions, and what proceeded was the ugliest of cries. It was. I mean, is crying ever pretty? I mean, probably not. But it was that uncontrollable sobbing. And just literally, as quickly as I was trying to towel myself off, I was getting equally wet, especially on my cheeks and chest downward, right? And it was hard because I saw myself for really the first time, and I also acknowledged, wow, I am this person looking back at me, but I don't like that person. And this feeling, right, just sort of overcame me. And I found myself just questioning everything, certain ideations as well that I don't need to bring up. But as most people with those mental health challenges, that's a very, very much a reality that seems very appealing at times. But something in me just started to realize, sort of this question. It's like, what if things don't get better than they are right now? Like, what if this is as good as it gets?
Hmm.
And I was like, well, it can't be as good as it gets because I know it's taken me about 5 years to get here. Things haven't gotten better. Well, if I keep doing this, by the time I'm 20, 5 years from now, because right around then, there was also a lot of talk at the high school. You're meeting with the guidance counselors, trying to figure out where you're going to go. And so this future ideation was very much present for me, and which is probably a good thing at the time because it forced me to really take account of where am I at right now and where do I want to go in the next few years. And complete honesty here, I was more afraid of not changing. I really became very, very scared that you know I wasn't going to change. And so much so that as intimidating it was to try to acknowledge to myself that I think it's time to make some changes, I didn't have any idea what that was or how to do it or what I would do, or more importantly, who might help me. Like I don't know if I can do this on my own. And so there's all these big W questions, right? The big W's floating around my mind, and but I didn't care. I did that was less fearful than the idea of putting on more weight, becoming more introverted, and continuing down this path that I'd been on. And I remember charging out of the bathroom, got dressed, of course, and found my dad in the living room. And I'm like, hey, found my dad. And and he could see something was going on with me because I was like agitated. Obviously, my eyeballs red, from the crying. But I said to him, I'm like, Dad, I don't want to be like this anymore. I want to be healthy. And my dad, he was controlling his elateness, right? Like he was happy at this point because, over the years, him and my mom, I mean, when you have kids, all you want to do is make that smile reappear when they're feeling down. I mean, it's the hardest thing as a parent is seeing your kids unhappy. And I get that now in such a big way, being a father of two. And my dad's like, okay, oh, sure. Yeah. What can we do? Like, how can I help you? And I'm like, Dad, I remember as a kid, I used to love riding a bike. Do you think we could get me a bike? And sure enough, he's like, yeah, let's do that. And we literally went out within the hour and got me a bike. I brought it back, went out for a bike ride. It was about 3 blocks. I was pretty gassed after I wasn't going very far initially, but I was excited that here was something I could do. I enjoyed it. I knew it was going to be hard, but I was excited that this is how the change was going to start.
So
And
that's a lot of
yeah,
insight for a
yeah.
16-year-old. I mean,
I've unpacked it now. I'm sort of repeating back. I've also, I'm skipping over some stuff, but, it wasn't until my early
sure.
30s, so about 15 years ago, I really gave myself the space to go back and reconcile things with myself as that younger self. We often hear people speaking about this type of inner work, and I'm a big proponent for it now. At the time, I used to think it was more woo-woo than anything, and I'm just being honest. That was sort of my opinion, my belief system. Thinking that yeah, I'm not crazy. I don't need to see a psychologist, like, and this is just where I was, at early 30s. Most of my association with other men that had the same belief, would say the same things. And so I was just doing what everybody else was doing that I was hanging out with. And I didn't know anything different. And
Yeah.
this was something that's been repeated quite often in my life up until my early 30s. It was sort of trying to keep up with everybody else, trying to do what everybody else, or what I believed everybody else expected of me, versus actually getting honest with myself. What do I want? Like, who am I? And really big
Mhm.
questions, of course. And those weren't questions that were front of mind for me as a teenager. Because if you were to ask me what was the big motivation, I'll tell you, Heather, I wanted a girlfriend. Okay. I did. That was the extrinsic driver for me at that time. And if we dig below that, obviously I was wanting somebody to want me. I wanted to feel like I had something
Mhm.
of value and I was seen as someone of value. And I got started with that change. Went to the library, got books out, and this is where my kids usually interject. Like, why don't you just Google it? Well, hey, I'm older than Google, they just don't get it, right? They don't understand how to find a book in a library, which I think is hilarious. But,
Right.
and I brought them back and I just started to consume information to grow my knowledge. I also started to gain a little bit of confidence as I started to see some changes. And that gave me a little bit of oh, maybe I can talk to a couple of my peers at school, some of the cool kids, the jocks, right? Like maybe just ask them, and fortunately for me, like there was one guy in particular that was very good at answering questions for me, especially when I talk about exercise or working out. He's a really fit guy, and I admired him. And he was open to those conversations. So, this started what turned into a 20-month journey. And really, it's been my life ever since then. But it took me 20 months to release the weight that took me 6 years to put on. And that's the big thing I want people to take away. If they don't take away anything from this little anecdote here, is that one, change, when you decide for it to happen, start doing things differently than you're doing before, change does happen rather quickly if you want. But more importantly, this idea of, I don't know where I was going with that. Anyway, so we'll just leave it at that. Like it's,
No, I agree with you. I'm going
do you know what I
to
mean?
interrupt you for saying
Yeah.
that change. I
Yeah,
think
please.
change can happen very quickly. It's
Yeah.
just that this is where, like, I'm listening to your story and like, I'm really intrigued because,
Mm,
there's that line between you're in something, you're
mm,
overeating, you're eating emotionally, you're eating to soothe your feelings. I totally get that story. It's
yeah.
a similar story when I was younger too. And then there's like this line that you just cross over, and
Mm.
like like a switch clicks on. This sounds like for
Yes.
you,
Yes.
and
Yes.
like you've had enough,
Yeah.
and you're compassionate enough with yourself to change. Now you wanted a girlfriend too, and I mean that's valid. Um, but then once you make the decision for change, it can happen really quickly. It can happen pretty
Well said.
quickly.
Yes. And
So it sounds like
but
that's what happened with you.
it did, but there's still a lot of questions because there's so many unknowns, right? And I know the unknowns can be very intimidating for all of us. The fear of the unknown. We often hear about that, right? And because it does usually imply there will be some changes, that are coming, and change is typically challenging. I mean, it just is, right? The bigger the challenge, the more the change it will be, more pronounced the change. From my experience and what I've heard from others, it seems to be par for the course. But it's not like we wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, you know what I want today? Yeah, I want some more change." Like I just
Right.
don't think we really wake up like that, right?
Yeah, people
And
don't like change. I mean,
yeah,
change is
yeah,
uncomfortable. I mean,
no,
change is
oh gosh, yeah.
scary. And, when you're in a routine of you're probably, like as a 16-year-old, like
Mhm.
it can be terrifying to think about, changing and all the what ifs and everything.
It
And then
really
you have to
is. And
deal with it. And then then you
well,
have to deal with a long-term change, then like you change
that's
and you
right.
lose your weight, the weight. And then I'm just wondering, was there a point where you felt fearful that you could go backwards?
There's always that concern, that fear, but I never really gave it a lot of thought, to be honest with you. I knew the path that I was then on, the way that I felt when I would work out and the way that I would feel by eating certain foods versus what my normal way of eating was before. I noticed very, very, I mean, it was real, like my energy was different. I wasn't feeling like I needed a nap. My joints started to feel better. My homeroom class was on the third floor. So I would walk 3 flights of stairs every morning. Right. And I remember not being gassed or not having a little bit of a bead of sweat form on my brow, like that was a big deal. That was a sign that there's things were changing, and they were changing because I was choosing to do certain things that would allow for the change to happen. And so it did build this sort of confidence for me that I can change, and I can change when I want to. But here's the thing: I was so focused on the exterior, anything that was perceivable from people from the outside looking in. I did no inner work. The idea of personal development, self development, no, it wasn't even there. Even though people would argue that what I was doing was self development. I mean, I wasn't thinking of it like that. It was just like, I want to get my body looking healthy. So hopefully other people either think I'm cool or give me attention, or, maybe a girl will like me, and that's what I believed I needed to do to create that. And again, I'm a 15, 16-year-old boy, and most of my inputs at that time is through media or, peers at school. So, that was just what I thought and felt. But I remember at age 17, so I'd made these changes, but I was still perceiving myself as that morbidly obese teenager, that inner person, that way that I would often see myself, even in the mirror and whatnot. I mean, a bit of body dysmorphia for sure. But more importantly, the mental aspect of my health hadn't improved really. I still had a lot of those feelings and that low self-opinion and just, depression was still there, and I was still quite introverted. But I remember being invited to a party and going, and I also remember being offered my first drink, and then another one. And I remember how I felt after those 2 drinks. I remember a lot of those inner voices got really quiet, so much so that I feel pretty good right now. There's those girls over there. I know we've been looking at each other. I'm going to go talk to one of them, and then even interacting with other guys, it was just more dynamic, more engaging. I found I was more extroverted, and I found that people were responding really well to that. Well, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out where I'm going with this, but I started to associate the person I was when I would drink as being the person that people preferred. That was who they valued more. That was who they were inviting to come to the party next weekend,
Right. The fun
And
guy who drinks a lot and can be
totally.
the
And I'm a
party
fun
guy.
guy when I drink. I always was. It wasn't like I was a bad drunk. I was very fun, very jovial. I saw it as a pass to do the things that I always wanted to do. Be the extroverted guy, be the jokey guy, be the guy that people want to hang out with, and
Yeah.
and really a lot of that, just that ego play, right? And but again, I was 17 at the time, and alcohol seemed to provide me that. It created the bridge, and it became a very regular thing. So much so that even well into my 20s, even meet my wife, I met her under the pretense I had a few drinks in me, at a restaurant, and it was an introduction through my brother, and things, took off. But just to give a prime example of how much this played into my life in my 20s, my eldest daughter, her name's Chardonnay. Okay. And it's not off the grape. Okay. It was very much so, but my wife and I shared a lot of bottles of Chardonnay when we were initially courting and really taking our relationship to a serious level. So it was always very meaningful. And it was a name I liked, being that I do speak French and I appreciate the French, and I love that just that name. But that was just how prominent alcohol was. It was like, it was so significant. It was such a big part of our life. I named my first daughter off of my favorite wine, right? So
That's interesting.
yeah, this is, again, just to give some context. And meanwhile, though, in my 20s, I moved across the country. I started going to university, but then I fell into a career selling fitness equipment. And I realized I'm actually pretty good at this because I can talk to people about health and fitness. It's something that I love. I've had a big transformation myself, so I feel very much I can help others with that too. Alcohol was just always there. All right. It was always there. And it
And
was
it's so
normal.
accepted. Yes,
It
exactly.
is
I mean,
so normal.
everyone's doing it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
seemingly. And it is very normal and acceptable.
It's wild. Like
Yeah.
how normal it is, especially even today now, because after the pandemic, I mean, when you look at the statistics of what industries really experienced a boom, the alcohol industry, massive boom,
Oh, massive.
massive boom, like
Right.
ridiculous. Like we're talking like, 3x, 4x, like crazy. And I mean, it could be a reallocation because there was no restaurants. We can argue that. But, I talking even to some of my close friends, they recognize that their consumption just went up.
Mm-hmm.
With anything else to do, and you find yourself sitting at home, and so it is just very real for everyone. I don't think anyone gets out of this one, and it became very normal for me. It was 15 years, age 17 to when I had that first sort of drink to age 32, where the wheels on the proverbial bus fell off in a big way, and everything that I had worked for and believed that was what I wanted. Like I do. I've always been someone that I like to think I'm someone of integrity, someone that honors their values. Because, when we have these core values, those are sort of the things like, Heather, and I know you're aware of this, but for those that are listening or watching, like these core values are those things that are non-negotiable. They're hardwired beliefs that usually have been instilled in us for a very long time. We are sort of creatures of habit, but we're also creatures of our environments at times, and so that, sort of nature versus nurture idea, that they both apply. And so certain beliefs around family were always things that I maintained as being very important to me, because they were, and I was raised that way. However, when I would drink, I remember even turning my phone off to tell my wife, "Oh, my phone died. Sorry, babe, I lost track of time." So I wouldn't have to worry about getting home, and I mean, that's just tip of the iceberg. There was lots of things that I would do that would compromise on my values. And this is where I think a lot of us run into challenges, because it creates a situation that's far worse, in my opinion, because we're constantly lying to ourselves. We portray ourselves as one thing, but we know truthfully this is how we're really showing up. What we truly are valuing and prioritizing, which for me was drinking and showing up as that guy when I would drink. And it's hard. It's hard. And my wife, she was going to have nothing to do with it. We had got to 10 years in our relationship. We'd had many conversations about my drinking, but I was always very good at being great for a few weeks after one of those conversations, to the point that I would be like, "Oh yeah, look at how good I've been the last few weeks. Well, I'm going out tonight with a guy's supplier in town, or I'm celebrating the guys tonight. I'm going to take them out after work, like just."
Well, there's
It
always
didn't
an
matter.
excuse, right? I mean, there was right when you're in that, and when you're numbing out with alcohol,
Yes.
so like it sounds like you went from like kind of numbing out with food and then transferred it to alcohol. And when you're numbing out with alcohol, there's always a great excuse. I mean, it's Friday
Yes.
night, it's happy hour. I'm having a bad day. I'm having a good day. Let's celebrate. Like there's always something, right?
Wait, I'm breathing today. This is a good. Let's celebrate.
Yeah, there's always a justification for it, until you realize, right, what you're really doing is numbing.
It doesn't matter how much good you do, though, because that habit, that one thing, can undermine all the good, like almost instantly. Like, especially if it's something that everyone's aware that's a challenge, and there's an intention to maybe improve on that, and you constantly just don't, right? Like I was just not respecting it, because I didn't really want to change. I didn't, and I it was such a huge part of my identity. I was like, I don't know how I can be anything other than this. And this is what I always thought I was working towards. So why would I change that? And then at 32, everything changed. My wife, and I won't go into all the whole story, but if people are interested, I did do a TEDx talk about this a couple of years ago, where I shared about this very particular moment. And I'll give you sort of the, up in Canada, I don't know if we even have anymore. Again, dating myself, Cole's Notes versions of the story. People are probably like, "What's Cole's Notes?" There used to be a bookstore, anyways, and you could buy these little crib notes of if you had a paper due and you didn't want to read the Scarlet Letter, you could go find this little pamphlet that would give you all the high notes, right?
Oh yeah,
notes. Anyways,
we have those too. We have they're called something else. I can't remember.
Oh,
but
okay.
Crib notes, I think.
Crib notes, yeah.
Yeah.
And so the Cole's Notes was I'm going to give you that version, and long and short of it, we were sitting at the table after this one morning. It was actually almost noon, because I wasn't waking up. I'd been out all night, the night before, and I don't remember how I even got home. I didn't even make it to bed. I slept on the Berber beside the bed that night. Like, I mean, it was just not a good night. And when I got down to the kitchen, she sat me down rather quickly, and there was this look in her eye, and it was, I could just tell this is something very serious. It was a look I'd never had before from her. We've been together for 10 years at this point. Both of our kids are under the age of 6. So like, it's not like we had just met. I mean, we got some history. And she was looking at me in this way that made me feel so fearful, like really afraid, not so much of her, but afraid of the situation I'm walking into, because there's something here. There's something big happening. And she sat me down, and almost immediately out of her mouth, she's like, well, we need to formulate a plan on how we're going to co-parent our kids, because this isn't going to continue. This is not the environment that we're raising our girls in. And of course, I'm like, oh gosh, what do you mean? Like, trying to justify myself, and like I would do every time, right? Like, and it was just falling on deaf ears. She wasn't giving it any time or attention, because to be fair, the time for excuses were done. No more of that. And as much as I would often say, here's what I'm going to do, or these are changes I'm going to make, I was very good. Again, part of my sales background, now my speaking background, I can be articulate when I need to be, and convincing, and like, she just saw through it all, and she's like, listen, I don't want to hear anymore. I want you to show me. And it was ready for her to say that, and she proceeded after a little bit more time. She asked me a question, and this is ultimately the crux of this story. Everything, my whole life story, really. This is that pinnacle moment where really everything finally changed for real. Like, not just the external, but the internal was then put in a position to change. And she asked me a question. She said, Dai, are you being the type of man you'd want to marry your daughters?
Good question.
Oh man, Heather, I was like, oh my goodness, you could not have asked a worse, better question ever. It was instantaneous almost, because I had this instant vision of someone like me at that time showing up on my doorstep, wanting to come in and get close to the 3 most important women in my life at that time. I wouldn't let them across the threshold. There's no way. There's no way. But that's what I was modeling. That's how I was mentoring, just through my actions every day, showing my kids, this is what a dad is. This is what a husband is. This is what a son is. This is what a brother is. This is what a business owner is. This is what a community leader is. This is what I was telling them. Like, I was the bar, right? The standard. And I wasn't very high, and I realized this very quickly in her asking me that question. And, I'll sort of skate over some of the stuff, but I got to a place where I was just, I'm ready to make a change. And it's eerie, because it was that same sort of feeling I experienced at 15, looking in the mirror when I got out of the shower that day and finally saw myself, but I think in this instance, it was like Christy's eyes were reflecting back, really what I was at that time, specifically around alcohol. Just this relationship I had with it was not healthy at all, and it was my first time really accepting that. Because, what's interesting is, and I just got to say this, because I'm sure there's some men listening that are maybe opinionated, or maybe, well, let's just say maybe you have a differing belief around this. But I remember very distinctly being out with the guys on some nights, and, we'd be watching the UFC, having a few rounds. The conversation is very surface, right? Like, we're never going very deep. Okay. We're not going to be talking about the meaning of life or any of that stuff. I mean, that's not happening in these conversations, but we would often talk about our spouses or our partners. And it wasn't positive conversation. It was usually us begging about stuff, and it was just so normal and okay. But I also remember them very passionately defending my drinking, like justifying that everything I was doing was totally right, and my wife's out of the, she's wrong. Like now, and especially after that conversation, I'm just like, oh my goodness, birds of a feather, right? Like, it's just so I just want to invite people, really take a hard look at who you spend the most amount of time with. And if you're not thinking or speaking or believing similar things to those individuals, and it's not a positive thing, what you're believing in, chances are it's just this collective, it's hard to break that cycle, right? Because of those connections, we think, well, they're my best friends, and like we've been friends forever. And anyways, I won't get into that too much right now, but I realized that everything to this point was my own doing, and I made a commitment to go 1 year without drinking. And I know there's people like, only a year? Sounds like you're kind of had a worse problem than that. I think maybe you should just be like not drinking at all. And listen, I tried making those statements before. I'm never going to have another drink again. And it's usually after an all-night stipper, right? Or like, whoa, I'm never doing that again.
Right.
But you sort of say it jokingly, and 3 days later, it's like, oh yeah, what are we having for lunch? It is, yeah, it's happy hour, right? Yeah. And it's amazing
so
how
soon
quickly
you can
we
forget.
Yes, thank you, Heather. But I decided I was going to go 1 year, because it was something that was measurable, but also what I felt was attainable. I mean, if we follow the SMART goal acronym, right? Like it was very specific, measurable, attainable. I thought realistic, but it was also time bound, right? It was 1 year. And I've been successful at doing a couple sober months, like sober Januaries to kick off my New Year's. I think I've done that twice. So, and that's a 15-year span. I'd had 2 months where I was sober, right? Like, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
Well, at times I used to be embarrassed sharing this, to be honest, Heather. I used to be embarrassed about this, but it's like so far removed. It's like I'm talking about a different person now, right? Like but that's just what I was. That's how it was.
Yeah. And when you do things like sober January, then you're just like looking at the clock, almost like counting the days until February 1st.
Well, we were even one more. We waited till like midnight. We timed it to have a late dinner, and anyway, so I'm embarrassed about that, but
I understand that.
we were eager, right? And so I made that commitment to go 1 year, and I made it to my girls. I got all three on the couch and made that commitment to them, but it was me that wanted it. Like I let them know I'm doing this for me. I would say it was my second most uncomfortable conversation in my life. The first one proceeded a few weeks later when I realized, holy smokes, what did I commit myself to? I was about 5-6 weeks in, and I'm like, this is unbearable. I didn't know how to function. Like they had become such wonderful crutches for me to function in my life. I took those crutches away, but I had a bad leg, and I was limping pretty bad. And it was tough, like really, really hard. And we sat down one night on the couch, and I don't know what came over me, but it was the very first time in my life I've ever been 100% vulnerable with my wife. There's always those things that you hold back, right? We all hold back. But when you get to know somebody, especially no one knows me better than her, but even in our relationship of 10 years at that point, I'd never truly been open with her about what was going on internally for me. I could express happipiness and I could express anger, but those are the only two shades of emotion I was good and comfortable at describing. I imagine there's like 100 men, thousands of men listening to this right now being like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Like it's pardon the cliche and stereotypes, but it is very true. And I can only say this because, I run men's groups and I do a lot of facilitating in this space now. And I hear this often, very often. And so I just verbal diarrhea all over my wife. I told her everything that I was feeling. I told her about how I felt as a kid and how I felt when I drank and why I feel like I need to drink, to have connection in life. And if I didn't drink, Christy, I don't think we'd be together, like just going through everything with her. We got to the end of that and she's looking at me and she says, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's going to be okay. I love you. It was perfect, perfect answer. And then she says, I think you should talk to somebody. And at the time, again, I shared with you sort of my belief around mental health supporters, people that work in the space and help people with that, especially psychologists. When I had a very negative opinion on that. And so, but in that moment, I was like, I felt so good after sharing with her. Like so good. Like I felt this weight lifted, it was very cathartic. It was like that ugly sob I had in the bathroom at 15, right? Same sort of emotional release that I experienced. And I was like, well, there's obviously something to the sharing thing. So, okay, I'll talk to somebody. Went out and found a psychologist, also found a relationships counselor, like a therapist to work with us on communication. But here, a little funny side note, we're on the couch there coming to the end of that first session. She's looking at Christy and she's like, Christy, Di, I think it's better if Di comes back on his own for a bit. So I just thought it was funny. Full intention couples, therapy, but they wanted me back by myself. So I'm not painting a pretty picture, I know, but I want people to know that's just how things were. But from everybody on the outside looking at us as a family and as me as an individual, and most people had no idea that things were as unruly as they were, and I went all in. Sort of like with my fitness changes I made, because I learned that change is possible. It's possible when I decided to make things happen. But I fully committed everything to getting healthy. And so here I was again. I'm like, well, I'm going to commit everything to doing this work to really figure out who am I.
I mean, that's what I'm hearing. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
what I'm hearing a lot from your story, is that you did a lot of, this initial like outer work. You had an issue with food and you're just going to buckle down and lose the weight and get fit and everything. And then same with alcohol, right?
Yes.
You had this problem and you were just going to fix it, right? Like a lot of men do, and a lot of women. I mean, you want to get it fixed, but
Correct.
You need to start from the inside.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Right. And it sounds like it took your experience, this bottoming out, if you want to call it, with alcohol, to then finally get really vulnerable with your wife and get real.
And I went all in. When you fully apply yourself to change or a change process, it's incredible how quickly it can happen, especially when you're feeling supported. Because it takes care of a lot of that fear, but more importantly, it also provides the clarity and the confidence to continuously take the actions. I find it's that lack of clarity that creates lack of confidence. And when we're not feeling confident, I mean, gosh, we procrastinate like crazy. I do. I procrastinate. I'll put things off. I'll do everything but the thing. And I didn't want to allow that to happen this time. So I just went all in. I literally did. I went like, what's the worst that can happen? And the worst that could happen is that I improve. I understand, why do I have this connection to alcohol? Like, why am I acting or believing these things about myself when I know if I talk to anybody out there, they don't believe those to be true? Why don't I try to prove them not to be true? And so it was wonderful learning all this new sort of way of unpacking and repacking this. And that's also where I got all the clarity of what I was enduring, when my parents divorced, and then being obese and dealing with some of the peer pressures, as well as the bullying that I had to deal with at that time. And just, really getting a better understanding, but to develop more compassion towards that child within me. We hear about this all the time, and I used to laugh at it. It's so funny, right? Like, I just see where I am now, where I was before. And I look at that guy that I was like, man, you really knew nothing. Not that I know much right now, but I know a lot more now through life experience. But I chose to walk that path as hard as it was. Okay. Because it is hard. Making those changes are hard, but man, were they worth it. So that's sort of it, and it set me on a trajectory. And this is the one thing I want to just sort of give as a word of caution to everyone. And it's sort of tongue in cheek, I say this, but when you go through some big changes like this, you have to be prepared for everything else to change as well. Because when you start to change yourself, your worldview, your world perspective, but also your perspective of self changes. And all of a sudden, what you thought created a lot of fulfillment, joy, and happiness for you might change. And which changes your direction. And that's what I left a career of 17 years, a company I co-founded. I was just like, I can't be here anymore. Over a period of a few years after that big shift, I exited that out and, went all in with my coaching and some of my online stuff. But more importantly, I quit a career. A month later, my wife quit hers. 2 months after that, we basically pulled the kids out of school, gave away all our stuff, packed up the SUV, whatever we couldn't fit went into storage, and we went traveling as a family. And so all these things happened as a result of me saying no to alcohol so I could say yes to the life that I'd always wanted, and
that's a lot of people's dream, right? Just pack it up and hit the road, and
anybody can do it.
Yeah.
Anybody could do it,
Yeah. But that takes a lot of change, right? That takes some that
Oh
inner
man.
work and everything.
Yep.
And I have a question though for you about
Yeah.
just self-sabotage, because
Mm, mm,
how do you prevent and how have you prevented just
mm,
self-sabotage? I mean, going backwards and,
mhm.
blowing it all.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if like, underneath you're like, am I going to be able to maintain this? Like, am I going to be able to like,
Mm,
really, is this going to be the rest of my life where I don't drink? Or am I going to be able to maintain my weight and my, and my fitness? Do you ever have those fears of going
y-
backwards?
y- Yeah, well, it's funny because I still deal with a bit of anxiety from time to time, but I manage it really well. And same like depression, I have moments where I feel depressed as well. And I mean, I don't know if any of us got out of the pandemic without those emotions occasionally, but it's always been a part of who I am. And learning to manage it's what's important. And why I'm bringing this up is it's that the interesting thing about beliefs are we're very good at defending our beliefs whether they're negative or positive. I mean, we have a belief that's not a positive one about ourselves. Like, I am this. We will often go out and try to prove that. And there's some people that refer to this also as confirmation bias. Like it could be a belief that's completely erroneous, but we believe it to be true. And that's enough. And it's enough so much so that we will do whatever we can to prove it to be true. I believe that what can really be helpful, and it was helpful for myself especially, was identifying what are some of those things. What are those beliefs that are sort of the default beliefs? Because the neat thing about our brains is they are what they call it's got sort of it's like plastic, right? They call it neuroplasticity, like this ability for the brain to be rewired quite literally. But the only way you override certain habits is you have to create a new habit, and that has to be the primary normal habit that you do enough that it overrides the old one eventually. People are like, well, how long does that take? I'm like, I don't know. As long as it takes, like
Right.
you look that up online. I mean, it's nothing more frustrating than typing that in. How long does it take to form a new habit? Like just type that question in. You're going to get 101 different answers. And every one of them will say, this has been scientifically proven. I'm like, okay, well, we got a problem here because you're all saying it's scientifically proven that it's, 3 weeks, 21 days. Oh, well, 5.5 weeks.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
90 days. I'm
Takes
like,
21 days to make a new habit. Yes.
yeah. And so I can appreciate maybe that was in that moment in that one study for that group of people. Sure, it worked. But typically, it takes a while. And it's going to take as long as it takes probably for you to form the initial one to form the new one. And I started with a 1 year commitment, and I invite people to just start with a smaller commitment because you have to be able to prove to yourself that you can follow through with a commitment, that you can achieve results. Because if you have that underlying belief, a limiting belief that I do things, I never finish them, or I do things and I fail. I got to look at the fitness industry, and this is very, very common. People, especially when it comes to diet culture, they I've done 101 diets and they've had 101 great results where they've lost the weight, but then they gained it back.
Right.
Sometimes more than what they had before. So now they have a belief that anytime I do a diet, it's a failure anyways. I'm never going to keep it off.
This is why I'm asking, I think, just about the self-sabotage, because I think then, like, at least again, for my clients, my women, that they get stuck in this. It is a self-sabotage, like I already know I'm going to fail. Like I'll do
Yes.
this and then I'm going to fail. And it's a sometimes it's a hard cycle to get out of. I love that. I just love this part of this conversation because I think the one thing that also just stood, you mentioned two things, your why
Yeah.
and just the phrase, this will pass. This too
Mm-hmm.
shall pass, right? And that we have
Yes.
to sometimes get uncomfortable with discomfort, and be
Yes.
okay. And I know with alcohol, especially, and with food, but I know in my experience, I mean, that is something I had to get very comfortable with when I stopped drinking was I want the drink right now. And rather than just go for the instant gratification, I just had to let the feeling pass, like
Yes.
and it does pass, but you have to let it pass.
Yes.
And also I think having the why behind some of these big changes that you want to make is so important. It's
Yeah.
everything. I mean, you have to have something to hold on to. You
Right.
stopped drinking and you had, your kids and your wife, right? I mean,
Yes.
think about. And so the why is incredibly important. But I want to just talk to you also quickly about your 5 F's and
Mm.
your fitness, family, faith, finances, and fun. So are these the 5 things that most people should value, or are these your
Mm.
values, or are these the things that make up a well-balanced life? Talk to me more about that.
Sure. Well, I guess the writer in me likes the alliteration, right? I like the 5S. Easy to remember for me. But
Yeah, it's
we all have
catchy.
different. Yeah, it is. But it's also it fit very much my values, and I give these sort of as a framework. But of course, I invite people, if these S aren't your S, replace it with the value that is. And I sort of use this analogy or a metaphor of a home. So imagine our lives that we're living as a home that we're an architect of. And so we're building these homes, our lives, right? We're designing them, we're building them, we're reinforcing them. We build these homes, we put stuff in it, through experiences. But here's the thing: we have a foundation. First and foremost, any home or any building, it's got to be built on a solid foundation. For me, I believe the foundation's health first. And that can be mental health, emotional health, spiritual health. I mean, you can qualify it any way you want, but health. But now we got the 5S that live on top of that. We've got 4 walls and a roof. Okay. So fitness, faith, family, finances with an overarching roof of fun. Okay. Because if you're not smiling at least once a day, man, there's a lot of room for improvement. So, but this is sort of that idea, because here's the thing: if I know that one wall's got some termites and it ain't doing so well, I'm gonna have to focus on that wall a bit more than the other walls. Like if you're struggling with maybe putting some weight on, well, that fitness wall, maybe it's got some issues. Maybe there is a storm coming in that's going to rock this home, right? And those will pass, but are we good to weather the storm when those happen? And I always equate this, why I talk about health so often, and I'm talking about the physical, the emotional, psychological, but that health component is, if you think about it like a rheostat dial or like a speedometer, right? Like we get the engine revving, right? It goes up to all these different speeds. So we got like 0 to 60 miles an hour, right? Well, if we say being healthy or optimal gets us around that 50 miles an hour, well, great. We're optimal. We're cruising along really well here. But all of a sudden, boom, ailments come in. We're going to start to slow down a bit. Oh, but I'm still going 40. Okay, I can still cover a lot of distance here, and I can work on things to get it back to 50. But, if you're starting and you're at like 10 miles an hour and all of a sudden you get sick and that's your top speed is 10 miles an hour, you're getting down to 0, your room, right? That runway to stave off illness, chronic ailments, big changes that happen to you, right? But that you feel like have been thrust upon you. You can manage those much, much more effectively. And so this idea of the home is really that idea of people to be the architects, design the life that you want, but prioritize those values that are most important to you and honor them. And so that's sort of how those 5Fs work. It's really just a framework, or probably more appropriately, a filter, through which we can pass our decision-making processes, but also what actions to prioritize. And stop worrying about time management, because people are probably thinking, well, how do I get all the time to do all this stuff? It's like, don't worry about time management, but worry about commitment management. Manage how you're committing to use those blocks of time every week. Make sure that everything's getting a little bit of time. And if it does, good things will start to happen. They really will. But sometimes we have to create or take the time to do it.
I like that. I like thinking of it, and time management is such a catchphrase, but I love
Yes, it is.
commitment management. I mean, right. How are we going to commit to these really important things in our lives? Dai, it was so nice to speak with you. And
Likewise,
I really appreciate you being so incredibly vulnerable and telling your story, because I know that people will really appreciate it. And
thanks.
How
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, how can people find you and work with you? And are you doing one-on-one coaching, group coaching?
do a whole mix of all that stuff, and have an online community launching in about a month's time. So Q4 of 2023, depending on when this drops. So it might be up by then. New website launching as well, and that's really just my way of sharing a lot of free resources, just giving people the information. So because once you improve on your knowledge, it's amazing how we can convert that into wisdom fairly quickly. If you want to connect with me on social, I'm on all of them. Like all of them.
Okay.
But the ones I'm really active consistently on are Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you for creating a platform to capture these conversations. Really, it's the world needs more of this, and thank you for leading and showing us what's possible. And yeah, just feel a lot of gratitude for you, and thank you for today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And as always, if you loved this podcast, please consider gifting me with a 5-star review. It is so helpful for me to get the word out on real eating, our real bodies, and real food stories. Thank you so much and have a great week. Bye for now.